Hey everyone, Unreal for Real here. I just wanted to do a quick video about optimizing Unreal Engine for VR. I get this a lot, especially over on the subreddit, and it's a very popular topic, especially with publishing VR projects for the Oculus store or for Steam. Essentially, you really need to make that 90 frame per second limit, and a lot of people just have a really hard time with that. And I think that one of the key ingredients to having a successful VR project and to not wasting months on optimization is actually to start out on the right foot. So design your project for VR. Don't design your project with a desktop mindset or a console mindset and then try to adapt things. And one of the big things is setting up the engine for VR. And as of 4.20.1, there's actually quite a few things available to help out. There are newer versions of the engine out, like 4.21. I've had some issues with the forward render in those versions, and I think that that's one of the main reasons why I kind of shy away from them right now. Even though there are some advantages like the new particle system and different things like that, you can of course use whatever you're comfortable with. This video is 4.20.1, and that is currently my personal recommendation for VR. So basically, I've got a simple project open, and I'm just going to go over a couple quick tips. And this is a popular question I get over on the Unreal Engine subreddit. This is a very popular topic, and usually it's later in the stages of the project when people have already ignored these things and they want to try to fix it, which is not my suggestion. It's better to start out on the right foot. And so there are definitely developmental things like optimizing models and lighting and different things like that that I will go into in other videos. This is just the Unreal Engine setup to start off with the proper setup for a good performant VR project. And so the first thing we're really going to talk about is your project settings. There's a couple things you can do that will help out with performance immensely, and they're not necessarily right for all projects, but in general these are good tips. So basically you're going to want to jump over to Edit from your main Unreal screen, and then you're going to want to go to your project settings. And yours may look a little bit different, especially if you haven't started a project, or you have a very base project. Some of these settings are going to be different than what I have because I've already pre-configured things. So kind of bear with me and listen to what I'm saying versus looking quickly at what's on my screen. And so what we really care about here is going to be the rendering tab. And if we look at the rendering tab, we have quite a few options here, and there's a few important ones for VR in particular. And the first one of those is actually going to be jumping down. We are going to look for the VR section, and we have instanced stereo. So essentially, this is one of the more important options for performance, and it has to do with how many passes are rendered for producing content in VR. You have a left eye and you have a right eye, and essentially everything can be rendered in a single pass in certain conditions. Instant stereo helps out with that. Enable this feature. There's not really a whole lot of downsides to this. It's mostly just performance. The next one is the forward shading, which if we scroll up a bit, we are going to find that under forward render, forward shading. And this feature does have some drawbacks with forward shading. For example, is that rectangular lights, which are introduced in newer versions of the engine, are not properly supported. That's a known issue. It does also have some unusual effects with spotlights and fogging. So if you have atmospheric fog and spotlights, there are some weird effects that happen, and you kind of have to work around that. You can play with it. There's definitely some things you can do to optimize it, but essentially there's going to be a few drawbacks, but the performance increase is huge. The guys over at Epic say that it's up to 25% more performant in some cases. They included this and instant stereo really to help out with the Robo Recall project, which if you haven't played that game, very, very good game for VR. Also very impressive in the scale, graphics, and physics that they pull off while maintaining a high frame rate. And they definitely have some really cool video streams that you can find on YouTube that talk about how they did that, and a lot of it references these features. So I definitely suggest that for sure. And another thing we want to do is change the AA mode. So you'll notice forward shading. If you look at the tooltip, it says forward shading supports MSAA and lower default cost, which is a result of that, of course. But fewer features are supported. That's true, which is one of the things I mentioned. So you will want to switch that. If you scroll down a bit, you will find that right here under default settings, anti-aliasing method. And right now you probably have FXAA or temporal AA enabled. You'll want to use MSAA. This is in conjunction with the forward shading and is one of those things that is very important for performance. So go ahead and do that. Highly recommend that. And those are going to be the base settings. Some other things you definitely want to make sure that you have enabled, which these should be, but may have changed based on the way that you have your project set up, is under lighting. You want to allow static lighting for sure. You might end up needing debuffer decals, and this is something that does have some problems in VR for sure. And decals in general with transparency have some problems, but I've had good luck enabling debuffer decals in 4.20.1 and using transparency in my decals when I set them to debuffer. I haven't had any issues. So your mileage may vary, but that's what I'm going to suggest there. And then from there, there's a couple other things you can adjust that are going to be beyond the scope of this video for sure. But I will say that in the next part of this, we're going to cover post-processing, and we'll start by jumping into that now. Your post-processing settings, you can change the defaults here. There's a couple post-process settings that are just simply too expensive for VR. They might have a performance issue, and that's something you want to work around. My personal suggestion is getting rid of some of the more expensive post-processing effects, and then some of them that simply don't work right in VR. So with that in mind, lens flare. Lens flare looks terrible in VR and should not be used. So you'll want to get rid of that. You also usually want to get rid of things like screen space reflections, and there's a couple other things, and bloom for sure needs to go away. And that's kind of the effect that you get on lighting, like the almost like extended, I want to say blur reflection from lighting. It's kind of hard to explain, but if you're not familiar with what it does, you can look it up. It definitely looks decent, but the performance hit from it is just not worth it. So I usually suggest getting rid of that. Some other things you want to get rid of in VR are motion blur, which frankly looks terrible. You want to get rid of that. And also, you may want to adjust the depth of field settings. Depth of field can definitely be something that's expensive depending on how you handle that. So you'll want to take that into account. And after you make these adjustments to the settings, it will make you restart the Unreal Engine. So restart your editor, come back in and give your project a look over. If you already have an existing project, the things you're really going to want to look at is your lighting and how it's affected. And as an example, I did pull up a project that was just fine before. And if I move around in here, you'll notice a couple things. My lighting looks very unusual here, particularly in these areas. And it almost looks like my lighting was poorly applied, but that's simply not the case. After enabling these features, there's definitely huge changes. And if I move this mannequin over here, you'll see the washout is really extreme under this light. And this was a perfectly fine project before. A lot of this has to do with the intensity of lights and the way that the rendering and shading models affect it. And so you're going to have to go back and kind of toy with your lights a bit after this, rebuild your lighting, and definitely give things a once-over. If you're starting a new project, then that's much better. You don't have to deal with that. You can build things right from the beginning. And aside from adjusting your default post-processing settings in your project settings, remember that you actually need to add a post-process volume to your map, so in your world somewhere. And you can get to that from your mode screen over here, and then volumes, and you'll want to find post-processing. And you just kind of want to drag this into the world I already have one, so I'm just going to go find it in my World Explorer on the right-hand side. And here's my post-process volume. And if I double-click it, you'll see I just have it up here like thrown in the air. It's in the world, but it's not tied into, my scene, for example. And the reason for that is because I have it on bound, so it affects the entire world, and it's not just restricted to a certain area. That used to be called on bound on its own. I think now the setting says instead infinite extent, and I believe next to it it still says on bound in brackets. But basically, you'll want to enable that right there, and then that applies it to the entire world. And then you can adjust from here your settings as well, in addition to your defaults. And if you want to disable something, sometimes you have to turn it on. So like the intensity, you turn it on, set it to 0, and turn it back off. Everything else like motion blur, you want to turn it on, set the setting to 0, switch it back off, and just kind of go through that and do that with all of your settings as you kind of need to. And I always just adjust the defaults in project settings to kind of prevent forgetting that, but make sure to add the volume in and make your adjustments as well. And once you do that, you essentially have a great base to start out. You'll notice huge performance improvements if you just applied these to an existing project. I did a quick test with a simple VR project with a little bit of gun gameplay, and I threw in some AI that had some pretty intensive environmental queries going on to kind of slow down the game a bit, and I was definitely not making 90 frames per second or anywhere close. And after applying these settings, restarting and trying again, I was able to achieve a passable frame rate for sure. So I think that the performance improvement is real, it's not exaggerated, and I definitely think this is something that you should experiment with. If you have any questions, feel free to find me on the Unreal Engine subreddit. That is usually the best place to hunt me down. On there, my name is 503 Development. You can also find me in most VR games as Unreal for Real, and as always, you can find me here on my YouTube channel as well. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more videos.